The Galactic Council chamber on Station Nexus Prime had not seen this much chaos in 3 generations, and the noise level was getting louder with every passing minute. Representatives from 47 different species were packed into the circular assembly hall, and all of them were talking at once. Their voices created a wall of sound that included clicking and whistling, and harmonic singing and regular speech that the translation computers were struggling to keep up. With Ambassador Krell of the Valdrin Empire, slammed one of his 4 massive fists down on his podium, and the bang was loud enough to make everyone stop talking. The Valdrin were a warrior race that stood nearly 3 meters tall with armored bodies that looked like they were made of dark metal and faces that reminded humans of beetles from Earth. They had ruled their part of space for 8,000 years through military strength and a complicated honor code that other species found difficult to understand. Krell's voice was deep and angry when he spoke, and his mandibles clicked together rapidly, which meant he was extremely agitated about something. He said this whole situation was completely unacceptable, and explained that for 12,000 years the Temple of the First Light had stood as proof of what true greatness looked like. The strongest warriors from 100 different civilizations had tried to enter those gates, and all of them had failed. His own ancestor, who was named Warlord Kren the Unyielding, had spent 3 full years preparing himself through meditation and physical trials before he attempted to open the gates. He had failed with honor. Krell looked around at all the other representatives and said that now they were being told a human had walked up and opened the gates by accident. Humans were a species that had barely left their home planet and knew almost nothing about the galaxy. This had to be some kind of malfunction in the temple's ancient systems. There was no other explanation that made any sense. Counselor Venn of the Crystalline Communion responded in their musical voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The Communion were beings made of living crystal, and their bodies refracted light into rainbow patterns when they moved. They were known as philosophers and mystics who spent their lives trying to understand the deeper truths of existence. Venn suggested that maybe the temple had not malfunctioned at all, but had instead recognized something in the human that everyone else had failed to see. The architects were not simple beings, and their criteria for worthiness might be more complex than anyone understood. Director Hayes from the Merchant Guild disagreed loudly. Hayes was a short creature that looked somewhat like a toad from Earth, and represented business interests that spanned 30 different star systems. Hayes said he had reviewed the humans' personnel file multiple times, and found nothing impressive. Jake Morrison was 32 years old and had an unremarkable service record with no combat experience and no special academic achievements. He was just a map maker who flew around space taking notes about empty sectors. This had to be investigated as either fraud or technical failure because no other explanation made business sense. High Arbiter Telon raised one long, thin hand to call for silence. The Telon species were incredibly tall and thin, with smooth gray skin and heads that seemed too large for their delicate bodies. They had served as bureaucrats and mediators for the galaxy for as long as anyone could remember, and were known for being extremely fair and logical about everything. Telon stated the facts in a calm voice that cut through all the arguing. Yesterday at exactly 14:32 station time, human Jake Morrison had landed his survey vessel in the temple complex because his navigation system had failed. At 16:47, he had made physical contact with the primary gate. The gate had activated for the first time in recorded history. At 16:52, Morrison had walked into the temple and the gate had sealed shut behind him. He had not come out yet. Teln brought up holographic footage from the Council's monitoring satellites that showed the whole event. Everyone watched as Jake approached the gate with completely casual body language that showed no ritual preparation or ceremonial respect. He just walked up like he was checking out something mildly interesting and touched it with one hand. The explosion of light that followed was bright enough to see from orbit. Telon continued explaining that their sensors were now detecting massive energy readings from inside the temple structure. The entire building had activated and was showing power signatures that matched architect technology, running at full capacity. Whatever was happening inside was clearly significant. Ambassador Krell stood up again and volunteered to lead a team into the temple to investigate. He was interrupted immediately by Chancellor Mora of the Democratic Consortium, which was a political alliance of smaller species who worked together to balance power between the major empires. Mora was a Feloran who looked somewhat like a cat from Earth with silver fur and bright yellow eyes. Morris said that sending military forces was absolutely the wrong approach, and that this situation required careful diplomacy instead. The human government needed to be contacted first so everyone could understand what had actually happened. Krell laughed harshly and said the human government was meaningless in this situation. Humans had only been in space for about 70 years, and were basically children playing with technology they did not understand. They had contributed nothing significant to galactic civilization. Fen responded quietly that humans had opened the temple, which was definitely something significant. The chamber exploded into arguments again, with everyone shouting over each other. Some representatives demanded immediate military action, while others wanted to wait and study the situation more carefully. A few suggested declaring the entire planet off limits until proper protocols could be established. Admiral Lisa Grant of the Terran Defense Force sat in the human delegation's corner and watched the chaos with carefully controlled frustration on her face. She was a career military officer with gray hair and sharp eyes who had spent 3 decades protecting humanity's expanding territory in space. Next to her sat Dr. Carl Hudson, who was humanity's chief expert on ancient alien civilizations and was frantically scrolling through everything known about the architects on his tablet computer. Grant muttered quietly that the Council was going to tear itself apart over this situation, and that humans needed to control the narrative before it controlled them. Hudson looked up from his reading with worry clear on his weathered face. He said that Grant needed to understand what this meant. If Jake had actually opened that temple, and if the architect technology had recognized him as worthy, then every assumption about galactic hierarchy had just been thrown out completely. Grant said that was exactly why half the representatives in the room wanted to declare it a malfunction, and the other half wanted to dissect Jake to figure out what made him special enough to succeed where legends had failed. Hudson asked if Jake actually was special in any way. He had read Jake's personnel file 3 times now and found the man to be thoroughly average by every measure that humans used to judge people. Grant smiled grimly and said that maybe being average was exactly the point. Before she could explain what she meant, High Arbiter Teln called for order again. A decision had to be made about the situation. The human was still inside the temple with no way to contact him and no way to know if he was alive or dead. The council needed to vote on whether to wait or to attempt forcing entry into the structure. Ben's voice chimed with alarm when they pointed out that the temple had withstood every assault for 12,000 years. Even the most powerful weapons known to galactic civilization could not scratch its surface. What made anyone think they could break in now? Krell growled that the temple was active now, which meant its systems could potentially be disrupted. He wanted to deploy a tactical team immediately. A new voice cut through the assembly like a knife. Everyone turned to see Admiral Grant, standing at her podium with an expression like steel on her face. Grant said with absolute clarity that this had become a human matter the moment one of her officers walked through that gate. Jake Morrison was a Terran citizen and a member of the Exploration Corps. Any action taken regarding him or the temple required official consultation with Earth government. That was treaty law, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Krell's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. He asked if Grant was threatening military action because her entire fleet could not stand against 3 council warships in open combat. Grant said she was not threatening anything, but was simply stating facts. She added that if Jake had opened that temple, then he had done it without training or preparation or any of the ritual and ceremony that other civilizations insisted made someone heroic. Maybe that revealed something about the architect's values that certain species did not want to hear. The chamber fell completely silent as everyone processed what Grant had just said. Grant continued by requesting 48 hours to analyze the data and prepare a proper approach. She suggested letting Jake come out on his own if the architects were willing to release him. If the architects had let him enter, then maybe they would let him exit. Director Hayes asked what would happen if Jake did not come out on his own. Grant met his eyes and said they would deal with that together as a Kuni. Sil and as allies the way they were supposed to handle difficult situations. High Arbiter Teln considered the request for a long moment before nodding slowly. The Council would grant 48 hours, but would maintain a military blockade around the planet during that time. No ships would be allowed to enter or leave until the situation was resolved. The vote was contentious but eventually passed. As the assembly broke apart into smaller arguing groups, Grant slumped back into her seat feeling suddenly exhausted. Hudson asked quietly what they actually planned to do with the time they had just bought. Grant stared at the holographic display that still showed the sealed temple gate, somewhere behind those crystalline walls. Jake Morrison was walking through a structure built by beings who had disappeared before human civilization existed. Grant said they would do what humans did best, which was learn as much as possible. She also said she hoped Jake was smarter than his personnel file suggested because he was going to need every bit of cleverness to survive what was coming. The Chamber responded to Jake's touch with what he could only describe as enthusiasm, and that honestly alarmed him quite a bit. Holographic displays suddenly multiplied and spun out from the walls and ceiling in arrays that made his head spin when he tried to follow them. Symbols and strange writing scrolled past faster than he could possibly read, and the low humming sound that filled the entire temple rose to something that sounded almost like music. Jake pulled his hand back quickly, but the damage was already done. The room had fully awakened and clearly had strong opinions about his presence there. He muttered to himself that touching weird alien technology was classic mistake number 1 in the Explorer's Handbook, and he should have known better. Hologram formed directly in front of him, and it was large enough that he had to tilt his head back to see all of it. The image showed a solar system that Jake did not recognize, but it was rendered in incredible detail. As he watched, the view zoomed closer to the third planet and then even closer to show a sprawling city of impossible architecture. The buildings seemed to grow organically from the ground like trees. Bridges hung suspended in the air with no visible supports. Figures moved through the streets, and Jake realized he was looking at the architects themselves. They were roughly humanoid with 2 legs and 2 arms and a head, but that was where the similarities to humans ended. Their proportions were slightly wrong in ways that made Jake's brain itch when he looked at them too long. They moved with fluid grace that seemed to defy physics. Their skin appeared to shift with patterns of light that changed constantly. No 2 architects looked exactly the same. The image shifted to show one of the architects standing before a massive crowd of other species. Jake recognized some of them from his xenobiology training, including early versions of the Valdrin and primitive forms of the crystalline communion, along with dozens of others he could not identify. The architect raised its hands and light flowed from its palms, forming complex structures in the air between them. Jake whispered to the empty room that the architects had been teachers. They were the first advanced civilization, and they had found all these other developing species and helped them learn. The hologram changed again, and this time it showed conflict. The beautiful cities of the architects were burning. Other species were wielding weapons that clearly came from architect technology, and they were using those weapons against each other and against their teachers. Jake watched the oldest civilizations in the galaxy learn how to wage war. Then suddenly the architects were simply gone. The hologram showed empty cities and abandoned temples and species, struggling to understand what they had lost when their teachers disappeared without explanation. Jake said quietly that the architects had left because the species they helped had started fighting. They had taken the gifts of knowledge and technology and used them to hurt each other. A new hologram appeared at eye level, floating right in front of Jake's face. It showed a simple symbol that consisted of a circle with a line through it that branched into multiple paths, but somehow all the paths still connected back together. Unity through diversity, or maybe diversity within unity. Jake was not entirely sure which interpretation was correct, but the basic message felt clear enough. A mechanical voice suddenly filled the entire chamber, speaking in a language Jake had never heard before, but somehow he understood every word perfectly. Later, he would realize the temple was directly interfacing with his brain and translating meaning, rather than actual words. The voice said that an inheritor had been recognized and the criteria had been satisfied. It welcomed Jake and called him Keeper. Jake said that he was not a keeper and was just a guy who had needed to fix his ship. The voice repeated patiently that the criteria had been satisfied. It said that 3,742 standard cycles of observation were now complete. 12,917 worthy candidates had been assessed over that time. None had succeeded until now. Jake protested that he had not done anything special and had just touched the door. The voice said that was correct. The trial was not in the touching but in the being. Jake rubbed his face with both hands, trying to process what he was hearing. He said the voice was claiming that the temple had been watching species for 12,000 years, waiting for someone who met criteria it would not explain, and now it thought Jake was that person. There had to be some kind of mistake. The hologram shifted to show images of various beings who had attempted entry over the millennia. Jake saw Valdran warriors performing elaborate rituals that demonstrated incredible strength. He watched crystalline communion members merge into massive consciousness networks so they could approach the gate with unified mental power. A creature that looked like a living storm attempted to overwhelm the gate with raw psychic energy. All of them were impressive in different ways. All of them had failed completely. Then the hologram showed Jake walking up casually to look at something interesting. He touched the gate with no expectations and no agenda and no desire for glory or power. He was just a man who saw something, curious, and wanted a closer look. Jake said that the temple had to be kidding him. The voice explained that the architects had been searching for those who could inherit their purpose. Not to rule over others, not to dominate, not to possess power. They wanted someone who would teach and guide and help others grow, while respecting their right to make their own choices. The great warriors had sought glory for themselves. The wise scholars had sought knowledge they could use for power. The spiritual leaders had sought validation that they were enlightened. None of them had sought to serve others without expecting rewards or recognition. Jake sat down on the smooth floor because his legs suddenly felt weak. He asked if the voice was saying that because he did not care about glory or power, and was just doing his job, that somehow made him worthy. The voice said that his species was young and had not yet created rigid hierarchies that determined worth based on birth or strength or wealth. Humans had known both great compassion and terrible cruelty in their short history. They stood at the moment of choice that all civilizations eventually faced. The architects had left tools for those who would guide others wisely. Jake was the first being found capable of bearing that responsibility. Jake said he did not want responsibility. He mapped empty sectors of space. He cataloged asteroid fields. He filed reports that nobody read. That was his entire job. The voice said yes, and Jake could swear it sounded amused. It said that was exactly why he had been chosen. Before Jake could respond, the walls of the chamber began shifting. Panels slid aside smoothly, revealing alcoves filled with objects that glowed with internal light. There were devices whose purpose Jake could not guess. Crystals pulsed with energy and colors he had no names for. What looked like simple hand tools somehow felt impossibly significant when he looked at them. The voice continued explaining that the archive contained 12,000 years of accumulated knowledge. Technologies and philosophies and histories of 1,000 different worlds. The architects had left these tools for those who would use them not to conquer, but to help others reach their full potential. Jake was now keeper of this archive. Its contents were his to share or withhold as wisdom dictated. Jake stood up shakily and asked what would happen if he said no. What if he just left and went back to his ship? The voice said the gates would permit his departure. No obligation would be forced upon him. But he needed to understand that the galaxy beyond these walls was watching. They had seen him enter. They knew the temple had awakened after 12,000 years. Whether he accepted this role or not, he had already changed the course of history. The only question was whether he would guide that change or be swept along by it. Through the crystal walls, Jake could hear faint alarms from far away. Ships in orbit, no doubt. The entire galactic community probably had sensors pointed at this planet by now. He thought about Warlord Kren, the unyielding who had spent 3 years preparing to touch the gate. He thought about the crystalline communion's wisest minds who had merged their consciousness to attempt entry. He thought about all the great heroes and champions who had tried and failed over 12,000 years. Then he thought about himself. Jake Morrison, who got average grades at the academy, who chose exploration because it meant spending time alone in space away from politics and competition, who had never wanted to be great because greatness looked exhausting and complicated. He said to the empty air that this was absolutely insane. The voice agreed and said the architects had appreciated irony. Despite everything, Jake laughed. It was a slightly hysterical sound, but it felt good to laugh. He said okay and asked what exactly he was supposed to do if he accepted this completely ridiculous situation. The holograms shifted to show a path leading deeper into the temple. The voice said first he must understand what he had inherited. The archive would teach him. When he was ready, he would face a choice about how to share this knowledge with a galaxy that had fought over scraps of architect technology for thousands of years. Some would see him as a prophet. Others would see him as a threat. Many would simply want to take what he had by force. Jake said that was wonderful, and here he had thought his biggest problem today was a cracked power coupling. The voice said his vessel was now fully integrated with the temple systems and had been upgraded. It called this a gift and said he would need the improvements. Jake blinked and asked if the voice had messed with his ship. The voice corrected him and said it had improved the ship. The Wayfinder was now capable of operations beyond its previous limitations. This had seemed practical. Jake wanted to argue, but the complete absurdity of everything was starting to sink in fully. He was standing in a 12,000-year-old temple talking to an artificial intelligence left by a vanished civilization, apparently because he was too unremarkable to be corrupted by power. He muttered that his mother was never going to believe any of this. The voice said the archive awaited him and the galaxy beyond these walls was growing increasingly impatient. Jake looked at the illuminated path, then back at the sealed gate behind him. 47 different species probably had ships in orbit by now, watching and waiting. His commanding officers back on Earth definitely thought he was either dead or had gone completely insane. And somewhere in this vast structure was the accumulated wisdom of beings who had seeded civilization across the stars before humans learned to make fire. Jake said there was no pressure at all and suggested they go learn how to be a keeper of ancient cosmic knowledge, because apparently that was his Tuesday now. He started walking deeper into the temple, following the illuminated path. Behind him the holograms dimmed, but he could still feel them watching and waiting. Admiral Grant stood on the bridge of the Terran cruiser Washington, watching the video feed from the planet below with growing worry in her chest. 48 hours had seemed like a reasonable amount of time when she had demanded it from the Council, but now, with only 6 hours remaining and still no sign of Jake emerging from that temple, her confidence was disappearing. Fast, she asked Commander Lewis, who was her tactical officer, if there had been any changes in the situation. Lewis shook his head and reported that the temple remained active with energy readings that were completely off the charts, but there was no communication and no movement and nothing to indicate what was happening inside. For all anyone knew, Morrison could be dead. Grant cut him off sharply before he could finish that sentence and told him not to say it out loud. Dr. Carl Hudson rushed onto the bridge holding his tablet computer in both hands, and his normally neat hair was sticking up in all directions like he had been running his fingers through it for hours. He said urgently that Grant needed to see what the linguistic team had discovered. They had been analyzing the temple's external inscriptions using the new data gathered over the past 2 days and had found something important. Grant took the tablet from him and looked at the screen. It showed a section of the temple wall covered in the flowing script that the architects had used for writing. Below the image was a translation that read, "Those who seek power shall find only silence, and those who seek wisdom for dominion shall find only echoes, but those who seek nothing and who come with open hands and curious hearts and who serve without need for recognition shall inherit our purpose and guide the many paths to unity." Grant handed the tablet back slowly and said that this certainly explained a few things about why Jake had succeeded where others failed. Hudson said excitedly that it explained why every legendary hero had failed over 12,000 years. The Valdran warlords had come seeking glory and recognition. The Communion mystics had come seeking enlightenment as proof they were spiritually superior to others. The merchants had come seeking profit and advantage. Everyone had come wanting something specific. Jake had just come to fix his damaged ship and had touched the gate out of simple curiosity. Grant shook her head and said the universe's most important test was passed by not caring about the test at all. The architects had definitely had a sense of humor about how they designed things. Hudson said it was possible the architects understood something fundamental about power and corruption that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten over the centuries. He pulled up another file on his tablet and explained he had been researching every species that had attempted to enter the temple. They all had one thing in common, which was rigid hierarchies and clear definitions of worth and status. Their civilizations were built on the idea that some individuals were inherently superior to others, based on birth or strength or intelligence. Grant asked what that meant for humans specifically. Hudson smiled in a wry way and said, "Humans were too young to have developed that kind of rigid thinking yet. Humans were too chaotic and disorganized. They still argued constantly about what made someone worthy or valuable. They could not agree on anything important, which meant they had not calcified into absolute thinking. Their confusion and disagreement had actually saved them. An alarm suddenly beeped on the bridge. Lewis checked his console quickly and his body went tense. He reported that they had incoming ships, and it was the Valdrin flagship decloaking right in front of them. On the main view screen, a massive warship appeared, bristling with enough weapons to destroy a small moon. The vessel was easily 10 times larger than anything else in orbit, and was clearly designed to demonstrate military superiority. Grant recognized the specific configuration immediately as Warlord Krell's personal command ship. She ordered Lewis to open a communication channel with them. Krell's face appeared on the screen, and his mandibles were clicking rapidly in agitation. He said that his patience and the patience of the entire council was completely exhausted. The human had been inside the temple for nearly 48 hours with no contact. He was initiating breach protocols immediately. Grant reminded him that doing so would violate their agreement. Krell said the agreement had been based on the assumption of progress, and there had been none. He had 300 warriors aboard his ship, and each one was a veteran of a dozen military campaigns. They would enter that temple by force, and they would retrieve the human, and they would determine how he had bypassed security that had stood firm for 12,000 years. Grant kept her voice calm and level, and asked what would happen if the temple objected to forced entry. Krell said they would learn something useful about architect defenses either way, and that this stalemate was ending immediately whether the humans liked it or not. The communication cut off abruptly. Grant watched as deployment pods launched from the Valdrin flagship carrying armored warriors down toward the planet's surface. Lewis asked quietly what their orders were. Grant stared at the screen showing 300 Valdrin warriors heading toward ancient technology that had withstood every assault for 12,000 years. This would either be a very short fight, or it would be an educational demonstration that embarrassed the council badly. She said they would watch and wait and hope it was the latter. On the planet's surface, Warlord Krell himself led the assault team toward the temple. He was old even by Valdrin standards, and his armored exoskeleton was covered with scars from 100 different battles. But age had brought wisdom along with those scars, and he approached the sealed gate with appropriate caution despite his frustration. One of his lieutenants reported that the perimeter was secure and no defensive measures had been detected. The gate remained sealed exactly as it had been. Krell studied the crystalline surface that still pulsed with golden light and flowing patterns. It was beautiful and infuriating at the same time. His ancestor had stood in this exact spot 3 centuries ago and been denied entry despite years of preparation. Now a human had walked through as casually as entering a marketplace. He ordered his warriors to deploy the breach charges. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, placing shaped explosive charges at structural stress, points that their engineers had identified as weaknesses. The Valdrin might be known primarily as warriors, but they were not stupid about warfare. They understood demolition and siege tactics, as well as any species in the galaxy. The lieutenant reported that charges were armed and ready on Krell's command. Krell raised one massive fist and said this was for honor, and for the Empire, and for understanding. He brought his fist down hard and shouted the order to breach. The charges detonated simultaneously in a carefully calculated explosion design, had to crack the gate's structure without destroying whatever lay beyond. Krell had engineers who knew their work. The gate did not crack or even show scorch marks. The explosion simply stopped existing. The energy hit the crystalline surface and dispersed like water soaking into sand. Within seconds, every trace of the blast had been absorbed completely into the temple's structure. The gate pulsed once in a way that seemed almost mocking. Krell growled an order to try again with larger charges. They attempted 3 more times with progressively more powerful explosives. The result was identical every single time. The temple absorbed the energy and remained completely pristine without even a scratch on its surface. Krell's engineer said carefully that this approach was not going to work. The structure was not just incredibly strong, but was actively absorbing all directed energy. Attacking it was like trying to destroy a black hole with conventional weapons. Krell's mandibles clicked in deep frustration. He had known this outcome was possible, but hope and pride had driven him to attempt it anyway. The thought that a human had achieved what Valdrin Legends could not was like acid. Eating at his honor, he ordered his warriors to stand down and prepare to return to the ship. The gate suddenly swung open. Every warrior stumbled, backward in shock with weapons raised and ready. Golden light spilled out of the opening, warm and somehow welcoming. Through that light walked Jake Morrison, looking tired and slightly overwhelmed, but completely unhurt and alive. Jake stopped walking when he saw 300 armored Valdren warriors pointing various weapons directly at him. He said after a long moment that this was pretty awkward. Krell stepped forward, and his massive frame cast Jake completely in shadow. He demanded that the human explain immediately how he had opened the temple. Jake looked up at the enormous warlord, then at all the assembled warriors, then back at the open gate behind him. He sighed deeply like someone who was extremely tired. He suggested that everyone calm down first because what he was about to explain was going to sound completely crazy and he would prefer not to be shot before he finished talking. Krell said the human was in no position to negotiate anything. Jake said actually he really was in a position to negotiate. The temple had chosen him specifically, not because he was special, but because he was not trying to be special. If Krell wanted to understand what the architects had left behind, then he was going to need to accept some uncomfortable truths about what they actually valued in people. The warriors shifted uncertainly. This was not the cowering response they had expected. This was a human who had walked out of a temple that legends could not enter, and he was speaking with quiet confidence that did not match his small size. Jake continued saying that the architects had not been impressed by strength or power or wisdom that was hoarded for personal glory. They had wanted someone who would share knowledge freely and help others grow without trying to rule over them. Krell's ancestor had failed not because he was not strong enough, but because he had wanted to prove his strength. That was not what the architects were looking for at all. Silence stretched across the courtyard for a long moment. Then Krell's mandibles clicked in a sound that could have been laughter or rage, or possibly both. He asked if the human dared to presume to explain the meaning of sacred trials to him. Jake said he was not presuming anything. The temple had told him directly. It had been watching and waiting for 12,000 years, looking for someone who approached without expectations or demands. Jake had gotten lucky because he genuinely did not care about glory or power. He had just wanted to see what was inside out of curiosity. Now he was responsible for knowledge that could change everything. They needed to talk seriously, but maybe with fewer weapons pointed at his face. High above in orbit, Admiral Grant watched the confrontation on her screens. She asked Hudson to tell her this did not end with Jake being torn apart by angry aliens. Hudson said that based on what he knew about Valdren honor codes, Jake had just earned their respect. The Valdren admired courage even when it came from species they considered inferior. Grant muttered that Jake was not inferior to anyone, but she kept watching the screen intently. On the surface, Krell slowly lowered his weapon. The gesture rippled through his warriors as each one followed their leader's example and lowered their own weapons. Krell said the human had courage and the temple had judged him worthy where legends had failed. They would talk, but the galaxy would not accept his authority easily. Many would challenge him. Some would try to kill him for what he possessed. Jake said tiredly that the temple had mentioned something about being seen as either a prophet or a threat, and he was not thrilled about either option, honestly. Krell asked if he had accepted the responsibility anyway. Jake said someone had to do it, and apparently it was him. 3 weeks later, Jake Morrison stood before the full Galactic Council assembly, trying very hard not to fidget under the weight of approximately 1 billion pairs of eyes, watching through live video feeds from across known space. The chamber was packed far beyond its normal capacity with representatives from every major civilization and dozens of minor ones all crowded together to witness what they were calling the most important moment in galactic history. Jake was still wearing his Survey Corps uniform, which was slightly rumpled from all the traveling he had been doing. Admiral Grant had offered multiple times to get him something more formal and more appropriate for someone called a keeper, but Jake had refused every time. If the architects had chosen him specifically for being ordinary, then he would stay ordinary. High Arbiter Teln called the session to order with 3 resonant chimes that echoed through the chamber. Teln said that Keeper Morrison had spent the past 21 standard days within the Temple of the First Light, and the council respectfully requested that he share what he had learned during that Time. Jake glanced down at the tablet that Dr. Hudson had prepared for him. It was filled with suggested talking points and diplomatic phrases that were supposed to help him navigate galactic politics. He set the tablet aside without reading it. He began by saying that the architects had left this part of the galaxy because they were disappointed. Not angry at anyone, not seeking vengeance, just deeply sad about what had happened. That statement got everyone's complete attention immediately. The murmuring that had filled the chamber died to absolute silence. Jake continued explaining that 12,000 years ago the architects had been the first truly spacefaring civilization in this region of space. They had discovered hundreds of developing species across dozens of worlds and had helped all of them learn technology and science. They had shared their knowledge freely and hoped that with knowledge would come wisdom and maturity. He paused before saying that instead those species had taken what they learned and used it to fight each other, to establish dominance over their neighbors, to prove they were superior to other civilizations. Ambassador Krell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jake met the Valdrin's eyes directly and kept talking. He said the architects had realized that knowledge without maturity was actually dangerous. So they had sealed away their most advanced technologies behind a test. It was not a test of physical strength or raw intelligence or spiritual enlightenment. It was a test of character. They wanted someone who would share knowledge without demanding power in return, someone who would help other civilizations grow without trying to control them. Counselor, Ven chimed in with their musical voice asking if the architects had determined that Jake possessed this character. Jake corrected them gently and said the architects had determined he did not want power. He explained that was a very different thing. He was not special or particularly wise or gifted in any way. He had just shown up to fix his broken ship and gotten curious about an interesting door. But that was exactly what the architects wanted. Someone who approached things with curiosity instead of ambition. He pulled up a holographic display from the temple's archive, showing the symbol he had seen in the central chamber. It was a circle with branching paths that somehow still all connected together. Jake explained that the architects believed in unity through diversity. They wanted different civilizations to grow together and learn from each other, instead of trying to dominate one another. Every species had something unique and valuable to contribute, but only if everyone stopped competing for dominance and started genuinely collaborating. Director Hayes interrupted, saying that was a pleasant philosophy but completely unrealistic. Resources were finite across the galaxy. Competition was inevitable. The strong would always dominate the weak because that was simply how nature worked. Jake asked if that was really true. He pulled up another display showing technological schematics that made several representatives lean forward in their seats. He said the architects had left behind energy generation systems that would make resource scarcity completely obsolete. Medical technology that worked across different biological types. Agricultural techniques that could feed 1,000 worlds without depleting them. The architects had not wanted these technologies controlled by the powerful. They had wanted them shared with everyone freely. The chamber erupted into absolute chaos. Every representative was shouting questions and making demands and arguing with the people sitting near them. Jake waited patiently for the noise to die down, which took several minutes and required Talon to use the chimes 3 more times. Jake said once order was restored, that he knew what everyone was thinking. They wanted to know how to get this technology, how to make sure their enemies did not get it first, how to maintain their current advantages over rival civilizations. He smiled slightly and said that was exactly why the architects had sealed everything away. Those were the wrong questions entirely. The right questions were different. How could this knowledge be used to help everyone? How could these benefits be shared fairly? How could civilizations grow together instead of growing apart? Krell protested that Jake could not simply give advanced technology away to anyone who asked for it. Some species would definitely misuse it. Wars would follow and blood would be spilled. Jake agreed immediately and said Krell was absolutely right. That was exactly why he was not planning to give the technology away. He was going to teach it. There was a very important difference between those two approaches. He pulled up another display showing the outline of a plan he had developed with the Temple's artificial intelligence over the past 3 weeks. He explained that the architects had left teaching facilities throughout this sector of space and all of them were dormant just like the Temple had been. With the right authorization, which he now possessed, those facilities could be reactivated. Each one was specifically designed to educate groups of students from multiple species working together on shared problems. If anyone wanted architect technology, they could have it, but there was a requirement. They had to send students, mixed teams from different civilizations. Those students would learn together and live together and solve problems together. When they demonstrated they could cooperate instead of compete, they would graduate and take that knowledge back home. Chancellor Mora leaned forward with her feline eyes bright with interest. She asked if Jake was proposing some kind of universal academy for learning. Jake corrected her and said he was proposing multiple academies. Dozens of them eventually spread across many worlds. All of them would be based on the architect's curriculum. All of them would require genuine cooperation to succeed. Nobody could dominate their way through these programs. Students would have to work with beings completely different from themselves and respect their contributions. Ben asked gently what Jake required in return for this incredible offer. Jake said nothing. That was the entire point. The architects had given knowledge freely because they believed it should be shared. He was doing exactly the same thing. Any civilization could send students. Any species could participate. Rich or poor, powerful or weak, none of that mattered. The only requirement was genuine commitment to learning and cooperation. The silence that followed was profound and heavy. Jake could see representatives, mentally processing his words and trying to find the trick or the hidden cost or the leverage he must be seeking. Admiral, Grant said from the human delegation section that Jake was serious. He was giving away the most valuable knowledge in the entire galaxy for free. Jake corrected her again, saying he was sharing it, not giving it away, just like the architects had wanted. He was completely serious about this. He explained that over the past 3 weeks he had learned something important. The architects had not failed because they were wrong about other species. They had failed because they gave knowledge to people who were not ready for it, people who took it as a gift to hoard instead of a responsibility to share with others. He looked around the chamber meeting, as many eyes as he could manage. He said they were all standing at a crossroads right now. They could keep fighting over scraps and competing for dominance and treating different species as threats instead of neighbors. Or they could try something completely new, something the architects had hoped for but never lived to see. True cooperation between civilizations, not because anyone was forced to cooperate, but because they chose to. Krell asked quietly what would happen if the council refused this offer. Jake shrugged and said then nothing would change. Nobody would get the technology. The temples would stay dormant. He would go back to mapping empty sectors of space and filing reports that nobody read. Maybe in another 12,000 years, someone else would open the gates and find a galaxy that was finally ready to grow up. He smiled and said he hoped they would not refuse, though. He had seen what the architects left behind. The technology was incredible, but it was not the real treasure. The real treasure was the chance to be better than they had been, to move past their fears and their pride and actually work together for once. He paused and added that the medical technology could extend average lifespans by about 40% across most species, and he really thought everyone deserved that. The chamber erupted again, but this time the energy felt different. Representatives were conferring urgently with their delegations. Calculations were running behind diplomatic eyes. The offer was too significant to refuse, but too revolutionary to accept easily. High Arbiter Teln called for a formal vote. The council would decide whether to accept Keeper Morrison's proposal and commit to establishing these academies of cooperative learning. This was a binding decision that would affect their civilizations for generations to come. The vote took 2 full hours. There were speeches and debates and compromises hammered out between rival factions. Some representatives wanted guarantees. Others wanted oversight committees. A few wanted nothing to do with the entire plan. In the end, the motion passed with 89% support. Only the most isolated and xenophobic civilizations abstained from voting. Jake let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like hours, and said they should get started changing the galaxy, together. 6 months later, the first class of students arrived at the reactivated academy on Kepler 442b. There were Valdrin warriors learning physics alongside crystalline philosophers, Fellerins studying medicine with Teln administrators, humans working on engineering problems with species they had only read about in textbooks. Jake walked through what had become a sprawling campus, watching groups of students from different worlds struggle through problems together. The architect's artificial intelligence had designed curricula that required diverse perspectives to solve. No single species could complete the work alone. It was chaotic and messy. Arguments broke out regularly as different value systems clashed. Cultural misunderstandings were extremely common. Progress was slow and frustrating. It was also working beautifully, Admiral Grant found. Jake near the central fountain, which was a structure that flowed with liquid crystal in patterns that seemed to defy physics. She asked how he was holding up under all the pressure. Jake admitted he was tired but felt good about what they were building. 17 other academies were opening next month. They were getting more applications than they could possibly process. Apparently, everyone wanted a chance at 40% longer lifespans and unlimited clean energy. Grant said that Jake had changed the galaxy in just 6 months. He had accomplished what centuries of diplomacy could never achieve. Jake said he had just opened a door. The architects had done the hard part 12,000 years ago. He was simply following their instructions and hoping he did not mess anything up too badly. Grant smiled and said he was being too modest. He could have kept all this knowledge for Earth and made humanity the dominant power in the galaxy. Instead, he had shared it with everyone. Jake said that was what the architects wanted, and besides, this approach was better. They were building something together. That was worth more than domination could ever be. A young human student named Karen Price approached nervously and asked if Jake had time to answer a question about quantum mechanics. Her team could not figure out how to reconcile contradictory perspectives. Jake said gently that she was trying to prove one perspective right and the other wrong. The architect's technology worked with quantum states that were simultaneously contradictory. She needed both perspectives working together. Karen's face lit up with understanding, and she ran back to her team excited to try the new approach. Grant said Jake was a natural teacher. Jake laughed and said he was learning as he went, and the temple's artificial intelligence helped constantly. They stood in comfortable silence watching the sunset paint the temple complex in shades of gold and purple. Ships came and went in orbit, bringing new students and taking graduates home to share what they had learned. Grant said quietly that the architects would be proud of what Jake had accomplished. Jake said maybe they would be, or maybe they were still disappointed that it took 12,000 years. Either way, everyone was finally learning the right lessons. His communicator beeped with another question from Dr. Hudson about curriculum development. Jake sighed, but he was smiling when he said the galaxy would not teach itself and headed back to work.